The Measure of Everyday Life is made possible by support from RTI International, an independent, nonprofit institute dedicated to improving the human condition through research, development, and technical services. More information at rti.org.
Wherever you are, I hope you're having a good evening, and welcome to our show. In the United States, our news coverage is filled with references to public opinion polls. We measure the popularity of political candidates, perceptions of current social problems, even opinions on weight gain during the holidays. What many people do not realize, however, is that all around the world, interviewers are working to bring to light the thoughts and perceptions of people living in various countries. Public opinion measurement happens all over the globe, including in some situations where basic government infrastructure is tenuous and conditions are challenging. Today, we have a chance to travel vicariously around the world through the experiences of our two guests, both of whom have conducted opinion research in challenging situations. Karl Feld is currently vice president at GfK. Karl has previously worked at a variety of organizations, such as APT, SRBI, D3 Systems, RTI International, and USAID. Equally as impressive is the long list of countries in which he's worked, and that includes Afghanistan, Albania, Algeria, Canada, Costa Rica, Croatia, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Denmark, Dominican Republic, Egypt, Haiti, India, Germany, Kazakhstan, Mexico, the Netherlands, the United Arab Emirates, the Ukraine, Turkey, Sudan. I could go on, and in fact, I've got a long list here in front of me. In fact, it's an exhausting list, even just to read, Karl. And we're going to talk about those experiences. Thank you very much for being here today.
Thank you, Brian. And I agree, it is kind of an exhausting list.
Yes, right. A lot of frequent flyer miles, I imagine, with that. Yep. So, okay, excellent. Well, our second guest here today is Clark Letterman, and Mr. Letterman is a survey research specialist at RTI International. He has experience with social science research design, data collection monitoring, and project management in challenging environments. Before joining RTI, Mr. Letterman conducted field operations for a number of projects in Afghanistan in support of the Department of Defense and the Department of State, as well as non-governmental clients. At RTI, his main focus has been management and quality control monitoring for international projects, including extensive field work in Nigeria, Indonesia, Thailand, India, Brazil, and Colombia. Clark, thanks for being here. Welcome to the show.
Thanks, Brian. Appreciate you having me.
Excellent. Okay, so you both are helping to bring to fruition otherwise unmeasured opinion around the world. And you've traveled quite a bit to make that happen. And clearly, these are paths that you've taken that are full of adventure, but also considerable challenge. And I'd like to spend some time just talking about how you've each personally gotten to where you are. Now, Clark, let's start with you, because you're at an earlier point in your career than Karl. Now, you were a history major as an undergraduate. How did that focus serve you as a basis for a career in survey research?
Oh, that's a really good question, Brian. I would say that my academic background is eclectic, to say the least. In undergraduate, I went to UNC and majored in non-Western history, so that sort of gives you a clue that I might be interested in going to developing countries. I also did a major in security studies, so sort of interested in defense policy, that sort of thing, and also studied Arabic. So what does that all come out to when you graduate from undergrad? The answer is you go to grad school because not necessarily a job there. So I went to grad school, was doing a degree in international studies, and happened to run into Karl, as it may be, at a conference called the Southern Association of Public Opinion Research, located in Raleigh, and saw a presentation that he was giving about some work that he was doing at the time with D3 in Afghanistan. And I sat there and I said, this looks like what I want to do. So that's I don't think Karl's heard that story before, but Karl, you're the inspiration.
No, thank you, Clark. That gives me the warm fuzzies, actually. It makes me feel very
excellent.
good.
That's excellent. Well, no, there's some common points of reference here because we've actually recently in one of our past episodes engaged some researchers who had collected at a recent SAPOR conference. And so there are some connection points. Now, Karl, a number of years ago, you sat down with the former head of the University of North Carolina system, Bill Friday, on his public television show. And you recounted an origin story for your own career that involved the Berlin Wall. And it's a compelling story. Could you recount that for us here?
Sure, Brian. So back in the day, right? I'm going to give away my age here. But back in the day, when I was in school, I had originally intended to become an Army officer. And this was in the 80s, and the Soviet Union still existed, and there was still a wall and an Iron Curtain, and I was motivated to help protect my country and Western Europe. But as I was an exchange student in Germany, the wall disappeared. I actually rented a car at the time and drove out there and helped Germans chip pieces off of it. But my career went away with it. So I had to find something else to do. And as I was working through that process, I realized that there was another contribution to make, which was helping Eastern Europeans rebuild their societies with the new freedoms that they had achieved. And so I went into international development instead as a career. And in the process of doing that, I one day found myself in Novosibirsk, Siberia, in the middle of winter, conducting polls for the Yeltsin campaign. And I decided I really liked public opinion polling. It was really cool. And so I chose it as a career. I switched over to doing that full time.
Excellent. No, there's so much in that story that's something that I think many listeners can relate to, is just living through history, recognizing the changes all around us, and recognizing how much the beliefs that people hold do have an impact for the world that we live in, and we see societies and countries change before our very eyes, and some of that has to do with public opinion dynamics. So as I look at the long list of countries that you both have worked in, there's actually relatively little overlap. But so I was thinking about this before and wondering where there might be some points of intersection. I know one point of brief intersection, at least, is Afghanistan. And I know that some of the work that you've done there might not be amenable to public discussion, but I want to at least talk about the experiences that each of you had as a researcher in that context. Clark, can you tell us a little bit about the work that you've done in Afghanistan?
Yeah, certainly. So as I was saying before, I went to graduate school. I was actually here in this area at NC State doing a master's of international studies, and I happened to have a friend who I knew from undergrad, and he got a job in D.C. working for a small firm that was doing social science research, actually working in Afghanistan. One day he calls me up, says, "Hey, so I see you're about to graduate. Would you be interested in maybe coming to Kabul in 2 weeks?" And so I very distinctly remember this, graduating 2011, graduated on May 5th. By the beginning of June, I was situated in Kabul. And so basically the kind of work that we did was so both quantitative and qualitative research, looking at public opinion, and also trying to sort of shape messaging in regards to reintegration of fighters, and also trying to promote development work that was happening in the country.
So as you did that work, what were some of the obstacles that you encountered just in getting the measurement done and getting the public opinion work accomplished? Oh,
there were... what wasn't an obstacle, I think, is the better question. I mean, it's everything from, obviously, the security situation isn't good, and then the areas where we really need the best information are the areas that are the least secure, and the areas that are the hardest for folks like Karl and myself to go to. And so, therefore, you have to be very cognizant of creating a system of quality control and monitoring of the data collection that will hopefully allow you to get data that's both reliable, accurate, and usable for the client. So, I mean, security was obviously a major issue, but then just a lack of infrastructure on pretty much every level as well. So it was quite a slog.
Well, what's really interesting about that is it suggests that if researchers aim for what's most convenient, it could really skew, in an important ethical way, the perceptions that would come out. And so there's this obligation to work hard to make sure that you're getting and hearing from multiple voices, even though that itself might be really challenging, in fact, life-threatening under some circumstances. Right. So, Karl, now I know it's been a while since you've been in Afghanistan, but how does that relate, or how can you relate to that experience? Does it sound like a similar circumstance as you faced?
Yeah. There was a portion of my career where I specialized in environments like Afghanistan, and many of those characteristics are not unique to that country. Mm-hmm. The work I was doing in Afghanistan, this is an interesting thing I think your listeners might be interested in knowing, is that even though we commonly think of surveys as a public opinion measurement tool, right, for giving populations voice, it also has other applications. And so often I would be using the same social science tools to measure program effectiveness, to look at, for example, in Afghanistan, I did some evaluations of rehabilitation centers for Afghans who were coming off drugs. Right, and it was all about how effective is that program. It didn't have anything to do with public opinion, but the tools were the same, right? Which is something that's fascinating about this line of work, is that once you've mastered the tools, they apply to all sorts of different subject matter and efforts.
Absolutely. I think that's there's a set of resources and skills there that are applicable to a wide range of work. Now, I guess I'd like to, before our break, ask one additional question about the notion of public opinion. And I think our listeners might be fascinated to learn that, as hearing from your experiences, this isn't limited to just countries that have fully open elections per se. Now, how often, Karl, I'll pose this to you, do you find that there's tension between a regime that's in place that might be governing a particular country and the types of opinion measurement projects that you're doing?
It's an interesting question, Brian. And I would perhaps reframe it a little bit, because I would argue that any society has got tension at some level between some element of it and people who want to collect other people's opinions. So it's really just a question of where does that tension lie and what impact does it have on the ability to collect and then reshare or recommunicate what people think. In the context that you're providing it or suggesting it, there's a range of, should we say, governments that have different viewpoints on whether you should collect this type of information, from classic totalitarian states where surveys weren't even allowed or they were doctored to say whatever the government wanted. That was classic communist position. Through there are countries in the Middle East today, for example, where you can ask whatever you want and you can reshare it as long as it has nothing to do with the government. They'll allow you to do surveys. You just can't talk about the government. To societies like ours where you can ask almost anything you want, but people won't talk to you.
Okay, right.
So there's a whole other level to who doesn't want to share public opinion. Right?
That's a really interesting way to consider it. So that you've got multiple players involved, and sometimes it's the respondents themselves,
right.
and a intense desire for privacy or to not be inconvenienced, by a telephone call. So. Excellent. Okay. Well, we need to take a brief break. This is a really compelling discussion, and there's a lot more that I want to get back to on the other side of our break. When we return, we'll hear more about the difficult work of opinion polling in challenging circumstances with our guests, Karl Feld and Clark Letterman. You're listening to The Measure of Everyday Life, produced by WNCU.
Well, I finally did it. I opened a 401k.
What? Why? Just wait for the inheritance. We've definitely got a rich uncle somewhere. We're one call away from the winner's circle at the Derby, dinners with multiple forks, a vacation home in the country, using summer as a verb.
You don't actually think that, do you?
When it comes to financial stability, don't get left behind. Get tools and tips for saving at feedthepig.org. This message brought to you by the American Institute of CPAs and the Ad Council.
This is 90.7 WNCU, Durham.
Welcome back to The Measure of Everyday Life. Today, we're talking about the fascinating work that people do to measure what people think in countries like Nigeria and Afghanistan and Russia and the Dominican Republic. We are joined by Karl Feld of the research organization GFK, and Clark Letterman of RTI International. Clark, I want to talk for a minute about some of your recent work in Nigeria, as that's a country that's been in the news around the world in recent months. What types of beliefs and perceptions have you been measuring there?
Thanks, Brian. So I guess I didn't realize when I took this job at RTI that I was going to be summering in Nigeria, but it seems as though that's been my routine for the last 3 years. And we've been doing some very fascinating projects. Most of what the work that we do there is for USAID, and it's evaluations of education and governance projects. And a lot of that is actually focused in the northern areas that you might be familiar with from seeing news coverage of Boko Haram. So not specifically in the areas where they're actively operating, but along the fringes. And then also doing the same sort of work in the southern areas of Nigeria around the Niger Delta, which recently had a relatively strong insurgency that's being sort of brought under control. And so what we're doing is we're looking at programs that are being put in place to sort of ameliorate the grievances of the population that are leading to those sorts of situations.
Okay. So there a lot of emotional topics for people to talk about. A lot of really interesting questions to probe. But even just the very work of finding and figure out who to interview is a challenge in a place like Nigeria. That context is a really interesting one in lots of ways because there are these challenges in terms of what we might label survey sampling. As many of our listeners know, you can't often or typically interview everyone in a country. You have to select a sample that is going to represent, the larger set of opinions. And there's a science to sampling, and it's certainly not. It's often not particularly easy. Now, Karl, I'd like to turn to you to talk about some of the innovations in sampling, as this is a constant challenge and issue for researchers doing this type of work. What are some of the innovations in sampling that excite you as we try to do a better job of developing samples in different places around the globe?
So, Brian, let me frame why I think the new innovations are exciting for you, and then I'll talk a little bit about them. So, for those of you in the audience who have some familiarity with surveys, right? You're used to people calling you and asking you questions. And most of the places that Clark and I work, there are no phones. People don't call you. There's no conversation on the telephone. If an interviewer wants to come and talk to you, they have to find your house, right? And they have to bring a piece of paper, and they have to talk to you and check little boxes. And then they have to take it back to wherever they came from, which often can be 4, 5, 6, 8 hours away on foot, by donkey, by cart, by train, by bus, whatever. So the challenge in those environments is that in many of these countries, there's no list of people that live at all these places you're trying to get to. They're remote villages with no addresses. There are no directories. There may not even be a registered voter list to draw any kind of names from, right? So how do you create a representative sample in this environment that means something? And in the past, in the good old days, right, you did it by randomly picking houses as you walked down the street, and you hoped that worked out. Some of the innovations today that are really exciting are satellite imagery and GPS use. So today, instead of sending people out into some remote mountain village to pick every sixth house and talk to the fourth person in the family who's above a certain age, right, I can actually take a satellite picture of the village, and I can pre-select in a random pattern which of the huts he's supposed to go to. And then I can tell him randomly in which hut, which person he's supposed to talk to, so that I can assure the representativeness of the sample that I'm going to get back. That's the first exciting piece to it. The other exciting piece to it is we often were concerned that these people would go out to these villages and just make up the data and bring it home. Right? Yeah, no guarantee they actually talked to anybody, and there was no way to figure it out because you couldn't call the respondent and ask them if they'd been interviewed.
Right.
They had no phones. Today, we can actually attach a GPS device to the interviewer, and we can watch where they went. And I will know if they went to the fourth house on the 6th Street.
Yeah.
And so I can look at the data, and I can look at the GPS plots, and I have some quality assurance that the data I'm getting back actually represents what I believe it represents.
Those really important developments on both planes. Now, in a highly mobile society, how in a circumstance like that do you prevent the possibility of duplication? So you're sampling or you're looking at mapping houses or residences, for example, and you can check the boxes to, well, we've gotten this and this and this. If people are flowing and moving between, are there steps that can be taken to reduce that the impact of that on your sample?
Well, it depends upon what base frame you have to start with. So in many of the environments that Clark and I deal with, there's no base frame of reference to have any control over movement and migration, other than asking questions at the house when you get there. How long have you been here? Are you a permanent resident? Are you visiting? Are you a relative? And then you screen people out. Now, I can say that there are other cases. So, for example, I'm working on a project that deals with refugees from Syria due to ISIS activity right now. And, they're in refugee camps. They're completely displaced and in motion. And there's no reference for them at all to any sample frame. And so you have to start being innovative. Do you map them back to where they came from?
Yeah.
Or do you simply deal with them as new populations in new places? And so it's part of the challenge of what we do. And that's what makes it fun. We have to come up with a solution that works.
Absolutely. No, it really is fascinating because of that. And just I think sometimes people overlook the fact that these are, and by necessity, invented means that you have to come up with, to address these various problems. It's not as though you can just push a button and automatically you have a sample. That often you have to be creative in coming up with a logic and rationale for that. Well, another challenging part of your work has to do with the actual practice of asking questions. And I think it's fascinating to consider how that practice of interviewing itself may need to vary and adapt when you're implementing it in different contexts. Now, I'd like to ask how each of you would say that different regions of the world tend to vary in terms of what the optimal format or approach for asking questions might be. Clark, what would you say about that? Have you seen some variation? And Karl, I'd like you to weigh in on that as well.
Yeah, definitely. I think there's a huge amount of variation across regions, across countries, and even across geographic regions within countries. But a couple of things that I think are very interesting are, one, in the U.S., when we are doing public opinion polling, asking people questions, whether it be on the phone or face-to-face, there's an expectation of privacy that both the interviewer and the respondent assume that they have. Now, a lot of times when you're doing face-to-face interviewing work in Africa, for example, if you try to maintain the sort of gold standard of privacy that we would assume in the U.S. is what we should do as interviewers, if we do that, it only makes everyone in the community and the respondents more suspicious and makes the interviewing sort of process much more contentious than it would be if we did not insist quite as strongly on that threshold of privacy. So that's one thing that I've definitely noticed in Africa. So, Karl, you might have some other examples of interesting practices.
So I have two examples that I think are appropriate here. First would be from Afghanistan, although it's not unique to Afghanistan, is that often when you go into the village, as Clark was explaining, and it's a social environment, you cannot get access to people to talk to them without the approval of tribal elders or wise men or counselors or whatever. So often your visitation process to a particular research site begins with ingratiation to leadership, right? Often in some places, in some of the more conflict-ridden or difficult environments that Clark and I have dealt with, there's a step where you actually have to make yourself familiar to the armed authorities to make sure that you're not going to get arrested in the process. So that's one piece that's different than anything we would do in Western Europe or the United States. The other thing that I would call out, and it's very important and to be you have to consider it in a research design, is literacy, right? So we all make an assumption that people can read. Well, guess what? There are a lot of people in the world that can't read. And that goes beyond their ability to read the questions. It extends into the concept of orality, right? It extends into this idea that people think differently when they've been educated and they're able to read. So when you're asking questions of people that do not know how to read and do not think in a literate sense, they think in an oral sense, it affects the ability for them to comprehend the questions you're asking, which gets us into this question of how do I design my research so that I get back what I want to get back? Can I actually read them a sentence the way a literate person would understand a sentence and have them actually understand it? Or do I have to restructure my questions in a different way for a non-literate audience?
Okay, well, gosh, those are both really important considerations and important points to think about. I'd like to wrap up our discussion on a positive note in consideration of some aspects of your career and your work that have been particularly inspiring. I'm curious to know, with the work that you've done, Clark, to start, what's been the most rewarding aspect of your work to date?
Well, I think there are two things that I find really rewarding about this job. And so one is the outcome, or at least the desired outcome, which is that we go and we collect data, and then we're able to use that data and give it to policymakers, and they're able to create a policy that creates some sort of positive change in the world, right? And I think both Karl and I believe strongly that that's what we're doing. And so that's a great thing. But then also the process on a day-to-day basis, the kind of places that we go, the things that we do, the fact that it's constant problem solving and thinking on your feet, that just is the kind of job that makes you excited, makes you want to get up in the morning. So I think it's both a larger goal and then that day-to-day. Both of those are very rewarding.
Yeah, it's certainly never a boring job, I imagine. Karl, thank you. You've a long history of doing this work in lots of places around the world. You think back to that time, when you were at the Berlin Wall, and think of everything that's happened since then. Did you end up going where you wanted to with this, and has it brought the kind of reward that you'd anticipated?
Well, what's been fascinating to me, Brian, about the journey is that I picked the field, the occupation, because I knew already that the components of the things that I would do were all the things that interested me. They were all kind of bundled up together in one place. Oddly enough, a place I'd never thought I would find them, but there they were. And in doing that, as Clark has said, the driver, the end point, is that and I have actually had the opportunity in person to implement communication of messages based on data that create change. That is the whole point for people in our industry. So I have stood in front of audiences in Egypt and talked to them about what their people are saying and that they need to listen. I've talked to all sorts of ignored and underprivileged populations in developing countries and been able to share their messages with other people who care. Those are the things that really get you up in the morning to do the work. And on top of that, the one other thing I would say to people considering this field is that it's project driven. And every day you're going to get something completely different to work on. It's never the same thing twice. And that's what makes it fascinating.
What a great place to stop. I've really enjoyed listening to just a brief snippets from the work that both of you are doing, and it really is fascinating, but also critically important for the world that we're trying to shape of tomorrow. We're just about out of time. It's really been a compelling discussion. Thanks so much for sharing your time with us today, Karl, and joining us in studio.
Well, thank you for having me, Brian. It's been great.
And Clark, I really appreciate it. I know that you're off to more adventures soon, so thanks for being with us today.
Thank you so much, Brian.
Excellent. Oh, we want to thank our listeners around the world for tuning in, whether it be to our broadcast signal or to our live stream via the internet. You can find our past episodes archived on iTunes, and you can join us on Facebook and connect with us on Twitter at Measure Radio. You can find me there as well at Brian Southwell. I hope that you enjoy the rest of your evening and the week ahead. Stay curious out there.
The Measure of Everyday Life is made possible by support from RTI International, an independent, nonprofit institute dedicated to improving the human condition through research, development, and technical services. More information at rti.org.